old civilization that spanned multiple continents around the world. And in this video, I'm going to show you key evidence ranging from South America, the Mid-East, Southeast Asia, and when you connect it all, it far exceeds the realm of just a coincidence. Now real quick, let me get the big question out of the way that most people have when they hear this information for the first time, which is, okay, if we were so advanced, what happened to us? Or where's the evidence like metal buildings? Just when you consider how they were able to cut and carve these massive stones and place them, and yet they share similarities across multiple continents around the world, you have to start asking questions. They even have similarities between the depiction of the third eye, as well as animals. It's located at the center of foreheads. And like I said, when you consider the similarities between architecture and stone structures and buildings across multiple continents, when you look at these similarities, you have to ask yourself, were they built by the same people? Now, the true history of ancient human civilization is far older and was once far more advanced than we were ever taught in school. And in this video, I'm going to tie together 3 examples that prove that 1, the true age of ancient human civilization is far older, by more than double than that of what the textbooks have taught us. 2, that there was a massive global cataclysm that happened on Earth when human civilization was around, and it was essentially a total reset button for human civilization, that mankind was obliterated back into the Stone Age and had to start all over from scratch. And the 3rd example proves that not only were we alive at the time of the cataclysm, but that we somehow had the intellectual knowledge and capabilities to build a massive network of more than 200 underground cities that are completely unexplainable by scientists, archaeologists, and historians, some of which are hundreds of feet underground, more than 11 levels deep, have advanced air ventilation systems, and architecture that have completely dumbfounded modern engineers.
Mostly from the 1850s. Now these are all really old, and some of the earliest photographs we have of any of these major cities. Right now we're in Helsinki, Finland. And what's remarkable about most of these photographs is the lack of people in these major cities. Now the cities are fully built out. It seems they couldn't pack any more homes and buildings. And yet, they are void. They are pretty much completely void of people and activities. Many of the ports that we see are empty. There's no boats on them. There's no carriages. So this is really mysterious. Here we have some people. We see a dog and some horses in the background. But still, when you look at the scale of the city, now here's a picture from the early 1900s. Now here we do see a crowd of people. Now this looks, rather normal. What is unusual about this is the wear on the wall. This is apparently a brand new city, a new capital city, and yet the wear on the wall, what happened to that wall? This, either it's built on top of something older or some kind of cataclysm that really weathered that wall and seemed to preserve anything that was any higher than it. So really fascinating. We find this all over the world. The next photo here that we're going to see is in Finland. We see a very similar situation. Completely void of people, and it's just an absolute mystery. Beautiful buildings, beautiful architecture. Clearly seems, I wouldn't say old, but aged. I mean, these cities don't look completely brand new, and yet it's as if they are brand new when we don't see any people. I mean, can you imagine, what it would take to clear out all the people? Possible, you get some people that would disobey, and I don't know, maybe that's what we're seeing here. We do occasionally see somebody. Really interesting, because a lot of these cities were, just getting into their prime around this time period, and yet we don't see anybody. Now this is a photo. If you were to leave your shutter open, this is what you would expect. You see the people, you see shuffling, even though they are really not that many in that picture, but still, that gives you an idea of what an open shutter photo would look like. You would still see blurry images, similar as if you were taking headlights at night when you have those streaks. So here again in Finland, we see a completely empty port, and even the windmills aren't spinning. I mean, it's this complete frozen scenario. And it's a real mystery. Again, look at the empty ports here. And later on in the video, I'll show you some pictures in the Americas, in North America. I'd noticed similar things in the building in Washington, D.C. It doesn't seem like there's any people around it. It's very, very strange. Now here's Venice, Italy. And again, where is everyone? Just a couple boats? These areas should be bustling with people. Here's the Czech Republic, Prague. As if these are model cities. Now later on in the video, what I will show is a similar scenario in China, where they actually have built entire cities and there's nobody living there. They have freeways, 6 lanes on each side, not a single car on them. And it leaves a lot of speculation. Spain. Clean and smooth roads, and yet no people. The city of, even in that time period, the city should have housed barely a few hundred years of building in these towns. I mean, this isn't your modern neighborhood building, your cookie cutter. I mean, this is grand architecture, absolutely grand. And yet to be devoid of people, and not just in one country, but worldwide. And these pictures are nothing. I mean, this is just a little scratch, tiny little scratch on the surface. Paris, France, I mean, in this time period in the 1850s, still an absolutely bustling city, and yet not a boat, not a person, just a complete ghost town, as if a bomb went off. Really, really interesting. Now here is St. Petersburg in Russia. And St. Petersburg, I think, again, if we were to look at history, I mean, this was poor, poor people in this time period. I mean, barely able to eat. And when we see the city in the 1850s, again, devoid of people, as if this city has been abandoned. I mean, in this time period, to be so poor and have this kind of architecture and in a grand scale. And what we notice with a lot of these pictures is, mud on the sides of the building, as we can see on the bottom left corner here. So what can we conclude? Were we the inheritors of a prior civilization? It sure seems like the architecture all around the world is very similar in this Greek Romanesque style, and yet it's found from corner to corner, as if these were a similar people, a worldwide people, and somehow there was a wiping out. We see the mud floods, damage from heavy water, and the pictures we do see with people, it's as if they've just been introduced. Nobody's in any hurry to go anywhere. They're just standing around in awe, as if these people have been introduced into this area, as if they've just inherited these great cities. And by the 1900s, things are pretty well populated. Here in the 1850s in Mexico City, same scenario. Just a mess. A mess and no people. The streets are filled with dirt, overgrown. And again, even in Mexico, this architecture, this highly advanced architecture here in this picture, water aqueduct. And here in Washington, D.C., same scenario. As if we just walked into this, we inherited something. And really, there's very little proof before the camera in the picture. And our pictures begin around this time. This appears to be the beginning of our time, as far as anyone can prove. This seems like the beginning of our history. Anything else is just a story. But even this, 150 years ago, we really don't know. Even with the proof of the photograph, there is no proof. There's more mystery. Here we can see the port of Montreal, bleak, void, and yet the grand architecture, once again. Who built all this? Now we have stories, of course. Supposedly all this is known. But yet something doesn't seem to fit the narrative. Now there were great plagues, and great plagues wiped out half of Europe, and there were great fires, and much destruction in this time period. But what if it was all the same thing? What if it all happened at once? Wiping out. And of course, this is only theorizing. I have no idea. Another alternative is that they were built. They were built before any people ever came. And then they were populated. Now this idea would seem ridiculous. It would absolutely seem ridiculous if it weren't already being done today. Today China is building dozens of cities that can house millions of people. And yet, nobody lives in these cities. The amount of money and resources that it would take. And yet, somebody in their leadership seems perfectly justified in building cities long before anybody will occupy them. Maybe this is what we're seeing here. Maybe somebody knows, and they're awaiting the right time. Maybe the lucky ones. Maybe it won't even be called China then, and a whole new history will be written. Maybe. We really don't know. Well, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Have a blessed day.
The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. And this week's opening quote comes from Elie Wiesel. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Egan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Recently, you have probably heard me talking quite a bit about history, quite a bit about the lost nation of Tartaria, a nation that existed in Europe that nobody seems to know about. It's a nation that's been expunged from history, and yet it still exists on many maps. Well, it still exists on many old maps anyway. It doesn't exist on too many new maps, but you can still find it on old maps if you search for it, and it does appear to be quite a well-known and well-established nation. Of course, any academic sources that you question about this nation, they will simply tell you it was an area of land, it was never actually a nation, and yet, as I've also pointed out previously, we can find flags of this nation. And if it was just an area and not a nation, then it wouldn't have a flag. So it was in fact a nation and not simply an area of land, and there's every indication that it had also spread out to become a worldwide civilization. This is very much suggested by the similar architecture in so many countries around the world, very old architecture, which is all very much the same. And this is what is termed Greco-Roman architecture. But one would ask, why would every country around the world be building their government buildings using the same architecture? You find this everywhere. You find it all through the Americas, you find it through South America, you find it even in Japan and Australia. So why would they be using the same style? That's the question. And even not just the architecture, but the symbolism, the motifs, the designs, even the clothing, the styles of clothing that people wear, these are all very similar all around the world. They may not seem that way when you first look at them on the surface, but when you really analyse things, you find that they all have a common root, which very much suggests that all of these nations, all of these cultures were all connected. And no matter how you look at it, this is very much what is indicated, ladies and gentlemen, and also through the discovery of a worldwide language, which was Magyar, or the root language of Hungarian, which was spoken by the Incas, by the Polynesians, and also by all the Australian Aboriginals, and many cultures all around the world seem to have spoken this language. Polynesians, Melanesians, all of the island cultures seem to have spoken it. In fact, Magyar seems to have been so common around the world that one might question if one were to apply Magyar translations to some of the lost languages that we still can't figure out, such as the Rondo and things like this. Perhaps we could find that there is a way of translating them if we use Magyar. Who knows? It's just a thought. And something else you've heard me talking about a great deal is the evidence suggesting a worldwide mud flood that happened as recently as 150 to 200 years ago. As I've mentioned before, there's a Russian channel run by a man called Philip Druzinin who is covering this quite extensively, and I do recommend you go and look at the research that he's done on this, because it is quite compelling, and you'll find that there is evidence of this mud flood that exists everywhere. I mean, it did happen, folks, and it was a physical flood, but it was not water, and it was an event that covered virtually the entire world. We can find evidence of this flood across Europe, across the Americas, even here in Australia. And evidence of this flood appears as buildings that have a sub-level, a level below ground, and also as many of the buildings that look like they were carved into rock faces, look like they were carved into cliffs. There's a very real possibility that they weren't carved into the cliffs, but simply the cliffs flowed over them, or perhaps the cliffs even became molten around them. But however it happened and however it manifested, suffice to say there is a good deal of evidence to indicate that the mud flood is a very, very genuine event, and it's very likely that it occurred in the mid to late 1840s. And there's a lot of people who've been putting a lot of research into this, and a lot of information is being uncovered about what has truly happened in the past. And our history appears to be very, very different to what the mainstream has taught us, to what we've learned in academic institutions, what we learned in schools. In fact, none of what we are taught in schools of what our history is backed up by physical evidence. All the physical evidence says something quite different. And there may be some people that would debate that. They'd say, well, no, we've got a lot of physical evidence to support the official timeline, but really, when you look at the physical evidence, you can construct any story you want to make it sort of fit with the evidence, but you have to leave a great deal of it out, which is why there's so many great mysteries and anomalous objects and all the names they think up for all the things they can't explain. You know, and ultimately, folks, if there's one artifact that is out of place, then the official version is wrong. And there are literally hundreds of artifacts that are out of place, if the official version is to be believed at all. And again, these are all sort of listed as anomalous objects and great mysteries and all shrouded in secrecy and presented as something that we just don't know how they did it. But really, if you can face the very real possibility that they don't fit because the timeline and the history that we're given is completely wrong, then you begin to see a little bit of the bigger picture. And it is wrong, folks. Our history is wrong. I have no qualms in saying that. It's completely wrong. Most of it has been completely fabricated, and I would suggest that it's been done absolutely deliberately for a very specific reason. The question is, how did they do it? How did they erase history so effectively? And what really happened? Well, what evidence suggests really happened is, as I said, this mud flood. There was a flood that's gone across the entire world, and the mud flood, because it is mud, it's not water, it appears to have come from the land itself. The question is, how did that occur? Was it a natural occurrence, or was it simply done by somebody or something? And the other question is, of course, why can no one remember this? How has it been so effectively expunged from human memory and expunged from our history? Well, as I've said before, how long would it take to change history and hide history? And effectively it would take 3 generations, but you could actually